Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today is an interesting interview because I'm joined by Dr. Asha Lancaster-Thomas, who I will call Dr. LT, and she's going to be presenting the Evil God Challenge. And I didn't ask you this before the interview, but it seems like based on the work that you've published, you find this argument to be pretty I guess defensible. You've published in defense of the argument. Is that fair to say?
I have. I think it's a very complex challenge when you really understand it. And as we'll talk about this evening, there are several different ways to approach the challenge. I think the challenge is pretty compelling in many ways. That doesn't at all mean to say that I am definitely fully in support of the challenge, because I actually think there's still quite a lot of work to do to fully delve into it. But yes, I have published in defense of the challenge previously.
So I've decided I'm going to do a two-part interview. The first part's with you defending this challenge, and I invited on Max Baker Heitch, I believe is how you say his last name. He and Ben Page published a critical assessment of the argument. So I want people to listen to this interview to hear you give an overview, but hopefully in the process you'll lay out some of the reasons that you think it's defensible. And then in the interview with Max, I'll introduce some of those reasons that you gave in defense of the argument and see what he thinks. And so people can hear both sides.
Yeah, and actually the paper is fantastic. I really enjoyed reading it, so I would definitely recommend anyone interested in the Evil God Challenge to go ahead and read that.
Okay, so let's jump in. I guess I usually do this at the beginning of all my interviews. How did you get interested in this challenge in particular?
Well, originally, wow. So this goes back a fairly long time to when I was living in London and teaching secondary school philosophy. And I took my students to a student conference, my sixth form students, so they're about 17, 18 years old. And Stephen Law was speaking at this conference, and he introduced the Evil God Challenge. And I had never heard of it before. And I was immediately struck by it because it's so novel, so radical. And my students, not so much. And so I immediately went to explore it in a bit more detail. And I actually asked Stephen to send me his PowerPoint from the conference, which he kindly did. And from then on, I started to explore it in more detail. When I completed my master's degree at UCL, I focused on the Evil God Challenge for my extended paper. And then when I embarked on my PhD, I decided to focus entirely on the Evil God Challenge. So it was an interest that was sparked, gosh, about 10 years ago, and then has been perpetually interesting me since then.
Yeah, so Stephen Law is definitely one of the major individuals that have put this challenge out there, but he's not the only one. There have been others for sure. And your paper brings this out nicely. This paper that we're going to be summarizing, it was published in Philosophy Compass, and it's a two-part paper where you give this overview of the literature on the Evil God Challenge for a intro level audience like myself. I feel like anybody that's got just a little bit of background in philosophy can read those journal articles and probably get a good handle on what's going on. They're good intro pieces.
Yeah, and that's where they're intended to be, just to give like a general overview, a survey of the land, in this case for the Evil God Challenge.
Yeah. So I've linked in the description of this video that paper. It's like I said, it's a two-part paper, so you can go check that out after this interview. Okay, so let's begin with this. In that paper, what exactly are you aiming to show?
So overall, like I just said, really, it's trying to get the Evil God Challenge out to a wider audience. I think novel challenges like this are really important in analytic philosophy of religion. I think it opens new doorways, new ways to explore and critique different religions, different worldviews. So I thought it was really important to try and promote it, I guess, and to make sure that there's some I guess, ad space for people who are interested in the concept to learn a bit more about it and hopefully to continue the discussion.
Okay, to get the challenge, it's important that we clearly define these two hypotheses because we're going to be comparing them. And the one is the good God hypothesis, and the other is the evil God hypothesis. So let's start with the good God hypothesis. What is that hypothesis?
So the good God hypothesis is really simple, and probably if you're a philosopher of religion, you know it by a different name already. So the good God hypothesis essentially says that there exists one God, and that God is omnipotent, all powerful, omniscient, all knowledgeable, and omnibenevolent, all loving. So it's the God of classical monotheism, it's the God of Christianity, of Islam, of Judaism, but it's kind of a bare bones version. So it's just postulating the existence of God that has these three particular qualities, including, most importantly, omnibenevolence.
Right, that will be a big one. Okay, so then what is the evil God hypothesis?
So the evil God hypothesis is very similar. 2 out of 3 qualities remain the same. So the evil God hypothesis that says there exists one singular God, and this God is omnipotent, this God is omniscient, and this God is omni-malevolent. So this God is all evil rather than all good.
Okay, so basically we're holding the other attributes fixed, but
Yeah.
it's that omnibenevolence trait that we're going to change in the evil God hypothesis. It would be omni-malevolent now.
Exactly. So we're keeping 2 the same, and then we're just flipping that other one to its opposite.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this was really helpful. In the paper, you give 3 different versions of the evil God challenge. And prior to reading the paper, I had really only been thinking of it in one version. So it was nice to see the other versions as well. So I guess let's go one by one in whatever order you like. What's one version of the evil God challenge?
Okay, so I identify 3. That's not to say that there aren't more, but I think generally we can divide the challenge into these 3 approaches, if you like. So the first is the weak evil God challenge. And this was advocated by a couple of philosophers, maybe like 40, 50 years ago, but modern philosophers in this discussion of the evil God challenge tend not to take this approach. So the weak evil God challenge essentially says that the good God hypothesis and the evil God hypothesis are both fairly coherent, fairly reasonable hypotheses, and therefore there seems no good reason to choose between them. But they're both reasonable. Now, I don't really know any modern evil God challenges who take that route. So the more common approach is what I call the strong evil God challenge. And if you are taking this approach, you are saying that the evil God hypothesis, that there exists an all-powerful, all-knowledgeable, all-evil God, is incoherent or absurd somehow or for some reason. Now, then I further distinguish strong evil God challenges into 2 categories. So we have the strong evil God challenge from incoherence. This is the most common approach. This approach says that because the evil God hypothesis is either incoherent or absurd, and it is similarly reasonable to the good God hypothesis, we ought to reject both hypotheses. So that's what most people do. The third option is the strong evil God challenge from inconsistency, and that says, well, if the good God hypothesis, if the evil God hypothesis is absurd or incoherent, and so is the good God hypothesis, then we ought to reject them both. So essentially, because they're mutually exclusive, there's some sort of logical contradiction that would be implied by accepting both, so we ought to reject both. So I think pretty much all evil God challenges at the moment are taking that second approach, that strong evil God challenge from incoherence. But in general, and I think this is important to note, evil God challengers do not believe in an evil God. they are using this evil God hypothesis simply as a way to try to undermine the good God hypothesis.
Maybe I'm wrong about this. It seems like this is the case for any version of the argument, that there needs to be in place what you call the symmetry thesis. Am I right about that? That every version is going to require the symmetry thesis?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So go ahead and lay out what this symmetry thesis is.
Okay, so the symmetry thesis, and this is something that the law coined, and it essentially is the part of the argument that maintains that the good God hypothesis and the evil God hypothesis are broadly similar in reasonableness. Now, it's really important to include the broadly there. The philosophers that originally postulated the challenge believed, at least some of them believed, that there was an identical equivalence between the reasonableness of each hypothesis. But Stephen Law says that's not the case. There may be some slight differences in reasonableness. It might be the case that some arguments make the good God hypothesis like a tiny bit more reasonable, but overall they are broadly similar in reasonableness. So this is an integral part of the argument because, as you said, for each of the three ways of approaching the evil God challenge, the two hypotheses have to be similarly reasonable for the challenge to work.
Okay. Can you illustrate this symmetry thesis with the problem of good? I guess. So the problem of good is meant to be analogous to the problem of evil.
That's right.
The problem of evil is supposed to be a challenge for good God, but the problem of good is intended to be this kind of challenge for evil God. And so can you explain the problem of good and how reverse theodicies would work in its case?
Yes. Well, first of all, I think it's really helpful, and this is what Law does in his 2010 paper, to visualize this as two scales. So we have the good God hypothesis and all the arguments and evidence for that hypothesis on one side, and then we have all the arguments and evidence for the evil God hypothesis on the other side. And as we said before, the symmetry thesis is saying that they're going to arrive at about the same place on those scales. So probably the biggest challenge for the good God hypothesis is the problem of evil. So the problem of evil says, well, if this good God exists, if this omni-good God exists, then why do we see evil in the world, right? So why do we see natural disasters? Why do we see so many instances of moral evil? The world seems to be perhaps a pretty horrible place if we're postulating the existence of this all-good God. So that's a big problem for the good God hypothesis. Now, Law says, well, there's an equally problematic issue for the evil God hypothesis, and that is the problem of good. So if we're postulating an all evil God, then we would probably expect the world to be quite a different place from how we see it now, right? There's a lot of goodness in the world. So we can see beauty in nature, for example. We can see love between families and friends. There's all sorts of wonderful and beautiful things in the world. So if an all evil God existed, then it doesn't seem compatible with the amount of goodness that we see in the world. So this is perhaps the biggest problem for the evil God hypothesis. So we're essentially taking the problem of evil and just reversing it to the problem of good.
Okay. Yeah. And these reverse theodicies are intended to be symmetrical as well. So if you appeal to free will in the case of explaining why good God would allow evil, then similarly you might appeal to free will to explain why evil God allows why evil God would allow free will in order to get evil.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I guess the general idea is, well, evil God could have created these evil puppet humans that always do evil, but evil is so much worse if it's being done freely by human beings who have free will. So that there's a corresponding reason why evil God would allow at least moral goodness to exist, because he wants to, or it wants to, instill humans with free will. So the evil they produce is so much worse.
Yeah. And we could do other theodicies as well. I don't know how much you want to elaborate on like soul building.
Yeah. So I guess with soul building, we could just say, well, I think Law calls it soul destroying, this reverse theodicy. And so that's the idea that goodness can bring about worse character traits. So as an example, we might say, well, for someone to be a bitter and jealous person, there has to be some goodness for them to be bitter and jealous about. So in order for there to be the soul destruction the evil God wants, there has to be kind of a catalyst of goodness that we allow in the world, something like that.
Okay, so hopefully that gives people an idea of how what the symmetry thesis is and how it would play out in the dialectic, whatever kind of move you make to explain why good God permits evil, you can use a similar move to explain why evil God permits good. Yeah, I think I said that right.
Yes, it gets quite confusing, but Law also does say in his paper, and I think that he's correct, that there may be some theodicies, traditional theodicies, that can't be exactly mirrored. So the theodicy that draws on original sin, for example, I think, of course, at face value, we could reverse that or mirror that by saying, well, perhaps there was a moment when goodness was introduced into the world under evil God through some sort of reverse fall. But of course, there's no scripture that details that. So there are these potential slight imbalances. Things are not going to match up exactly, Law says, and I think he's right. Because of course, with the good God hypothesis, specifically classical monotheisms that draw on the good God hypothesis, there's some scripture, there's tradition that historically precedes it, whereas of course there's no religion of evil God for obvious reasons.
So we've explained how this symmetry thesis gets applied to like the problem of evil, but now let's apply it to some of the traditional arguments for the existence of God.
Okay, yeah, so this is another way that there could be asymmetries or imbalances. And I think that, interestingly, some of the most common arguments for the good God hypothesis that draw on philosophical arguments are the cosmological and the teleological arguments. And they don't really postulate any sort of moral quality in their conclusions. So the cosmological argument says there must be a first cause, for example, but it doesn't explain the moral nature of that first cause. So it's just as reasonable to say, well, yes, there is a first cause, but that first cause is evil. Similarly, with the teleological argument, yes, we can see design in the world or evidence of design in the world. So maybe that makes us want to postulate some sort of intelligent designer. But traditionally, that argument doesn't postulate the moral nature of that particular designer. And of course, we could appeal to different kinds of evidence in the world that seems to be designed for or designed by a benevolent designer, but then there might be other examples of things in the world that seem to be designed by a malevolent designer. You know, if we look at some of the ruthlessness of nature, for example. So both of those arguments, I think, are fairly neutral with regard to the moral nature of the divine that exists. And I think then with the argument from religious experience, and I have a paper about this in European Journal, Philosophy of Religion, and I argue that with this argument as well, it's fairly neutral. So philosophers like Swinburne argue that religious experiences of good God are really good evidence in the cumulative case for good God. But I think that evidence of religious experience in the world could equally weigh up the scale for evil God.
Can you sketch that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So one of the things I talk about is there are a lot of religious experiences of evil that are less well known than the sheer amount of religious experiences of good God. So there are reasons for this. Historically speaking, if you were to vocalize that you had an experience of an evil demon or some sort of evil god, you may be excommunicated. There may be a lot of stigma attached to that. So research shows that people have stayed pretty mum when it comes to negative or evil religious experiences. So I think that's one way that we can explain the seemingly big difference between the amount of experiences of good within the realm of religious experience and the experiences of bad. I also think that there might be underlying reasons why, if an evil God existed, that evil God would create some positive, good religious experiences. And this is something that Law mentions in his paper as well. He says that he can imagine an evil God wanting to give some people religious experiences of a Christian God, some people religious experiences of polytheistic gods, and that in turn would create a kind of chaotic, divisive world, which in turn would lead to violence and suffering. So I think we can kind of postulate some reasons why the evidence of religious experience that we see in the world could be as it is under evil God, just as easily as we could see why it is how it is under a good God.
Let's turn to some objections. So in the paper, you offer several kind of categories of objections. Here, I'm only going to focus on 3. So the first category is asymmetry objections. So explain what this kind of objection aims to do, and maybe give an example of somebody that raises it.
Okay, yeah, so asymmetry objections basically aim to undermine the symmetry thesis. So they say, well, okay, we've got these 2 scales. Here's the good God hypothesis. Here's the evil God hypothesis. Well, actually, the good God hypothesis is much more reasonable, or at least somewhat more reasonable. And of course, if you show that, then the whole evil God challenge is undermined. So an example of that might be to argue that the traditional theodicies are more compelling than the reverse theodicies. So maybe one example, and Kyle Keltz is a philosopher who argues this, he says, well, the privation account of evil gives us an explanation as to why there is evil, or seems to be evil in the world under the good God hypothesis, but there is no effective reverse privation account that can answer the problem of good. I think that's a really interesting challenge, and I, along with John Collins, have argued that actually the privation account of evil can be effectively reversed. In the privation of good account, you would have to say that goodness is just places that are lacking evil. Now, do I think that is compelling? Absolutely not. But do I think it is just as compelling as the privation account of evil? Yes. So you're maintaining the symmetry. Now, there's a kind of underlying premise, I think, in the privation account of evil, which is that goodness and existence are interchangeable. This kind of idea that stems from Thomas Aquinas, maybe if something exists, it is simply good. So if you believe that, then I think that would cause an asymmetry. And if you can really prove that, or if you hold true to that, then that would be a good reason to reject the evil God challenge. So I think, again, that if you are someone who believes in the privation account of evil and is unimpressed by the privation account of good, then the evil God challenge just simply isn't going to work for you. That's a fundamental intuition, or that's a fundamental metaphysical claim that you've accepted. So for you, the evil God challenge will be undermined. So that's one approach that people have taken. Or they could argue that the ontological argument or the moral argument for good God's existence is pretty compelling, and there is no reverse moral argument or ontological argument for the evil God hypothesis.
Okay, I get the point you're making about, like, you can maintain the symmetry. If you have a privation theory of evil, I can give you an equally plausible privation theory of good. I guess when it comes to those privation theories, and maybe this is getting too into the weeds, I'm not really inclined to accept those like a privation theory of evil, meaning a case of evil is just like lacking goodness. That's what I mean by that. Because it doesn't seem like every case of evil is that sort of thing.
Yeah,
I can understand why some evils would be that, but doesn't that privation theory of evil commit you to all cases being like that? All cases of evil being that way?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is why I think that the privation account of evil is pretty flawed. And Todd Calder has an interesting paper or two on this. So I think you're right. I think the privation account of evil can explain, some examples seem to fit really well, but others don't. And when we look at certain examples of evil and suffering in the world, they don't seem to fit the idea that that is just simply a lack of what should be. So yeah, as I said before, I don't find the privation theory of evil too compelling anyway. But if you
Okay.
do, and you
So
can
let's.
make a good case for that, then that might be an asymmetry potentially.
Yeah. So I'm not finding that sort of response to the evil God challenge very persuasive.
And I think in Max and Ben's paper, they actually develop this as well. So it'd be interesting to hear what they say about it.
Yeah, maybe they'll change my mind about that. But
Yeah.
unless I'm, and I could be mistaken, maybe they can develop it in a way that doesn't commit one to saying that all cases of evil are just like a lack of good, but it just doesn't strike me that that's what's going on in every case of evil.
Yeah.
But hey, they may change my mind. So let's move then to the second kind of category of objections. And I may, at the very end, I may raise some of my own thoughts in response to the challenge. They'll probably lie in that asymmetry category, but it would just be like a different type of asymmetry. But I'll come back to those at the end. So let's move to the well-being objections. Yeah, give me an example of this.
So there's not much on this. Tasia Scrutton wrote a paper in, I think, maybe 2016, and it argued that there is a reason to accept the good God hypothesis over the evil God hypothesis, which is based on well-being. So she says, well, good God existing is way better for us individually and as a society. I mean, for obvious reasons, I agree with her there. We definitely wouldn't want a purely evil God to exist. And she uses pragmatic encroachment to kind of support this idea. So she says, well, if something is, when the stakes are high and something is better for us, then that might give us a reason to promote it ethically. So we might consider it more reasonable simply because it is better for us. I don't find this approach compelling at all because of what the Evil God Challenge is trying to do. So the Evil God Challenge is not trying to promote belief in an evil God, because Evil God Challengers don't believe in an evil God. They're not trying to convert classical monotheists from the good God hypothesis. So I think most, if not all, Evil God Challengers would agree with her claim. Well, yes, of course, it would be better for a good God to exist. So I think that's kind of taking things into the realm of axiology and saying, well, yes, we should want a good God to exist and we shouldn't want an evil God to exist. Well, fine, I completely agree, but that's not what the Evil God Challenge is trying to do. So I think that those types of approach are only useful for weak Evil God challenges, which, if you recall, is saying that both of these hypotheses are reasonable and coherent. So which one do we choose? Well, in that situation, let's choose the one that's better for us, maybe like Pascal's wager style. But I think if you're a strong evil God challenger, as most of us are, the argument doesn't really work from well-being.
I have some sympathies with that kind of response, actually. And so I wanted to see what you thought about the way I was thinking of it. So you might run, okay, so you talked about arguments for God's existence. So someone may find some arguments for God's existence to not even end in the conclusion that God exists, but just that like a designer exists or a creator of the universe exists.
Yeah.
So that might be the conclusion of the argument. And that's as far as the argument goes. It ends there. I understand if the point of the evil God challenge is to say that, well, you can't conclude that argument. You can't conclude the cosmological argument or the teleological argument with good God exists. The argument isn't able to get you there because you can explain all the data equally well on the evil God. But if all the argument aims to show is that there's a designer or there's a creator of the universe. I don't see how the evil God challenge would challenge any premise in the argument as far as that would go.
Yeah.
Now let me continue from there and then you can chime in. So if someone is persuaded, okay, so there is a creator of the universe. I have good reason to believe there's a creator of the universe. And I have good reason to believe that there's a designer of the universe. But I just don't know anything about the nature of this being. I don't know whether it's good or evil, but it's reasonable to believe there is such a creator and designer. Then it seems like this sort of response can be applied and say, well, I have good pragmatic reason to believe that it's a good being rather than an evil being. And that's how I was thinking of it, as being, that seems plausible to me. What do you think about that?
So I agree with you, actually. I think if you are compelled by those philosophical arguments, and so you think, okay, there's definitely a designer, there's definitely a creator, then why not choose to believe in one that is going to be more beneficial to you, or is going to make you happier to believe in it? I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. I think then you would just have to accept that your belief in the good God hypothesis is contingent only on kind of what you desire, or your axiological preferences. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Why be pessimistic about the moral nature of God when you can be optimistic if it's going to make you a little bit happier? So I don't think, I would never condemn anyone for doing that. But I think the important thing that the evil God challenge does is help people realize why they believe in the good God hypothesis. And so in that case, he would say, well, there are multiple reasons why I believe in the God hypothesis, which is design and cause. But why do you believe in the good God hypothesis? Well, it kind of makes me happy, or I think it's nice to think that the God is good. So I think it just helps people really pinpoint the reasons for their acceptance of the good God hypothesis.
Yeah. Okay. In my case, that wouldn't be the only reason I believe in good God, but
the
way I was thinking of it is that there is a reason that favors good God, that favors belief in good God over belief in evil God, and that would be one such reason. Yeah. So that's how I was
so I see what you mean. So I guess it's a kind of asymmetry, but you're accepting the premise that it's okay. Well, you're accepting pragmatic encroachment, basically. You're saying, well, actually, it's okay to base how reasonable I judge something on how good it is for me.
In a case of like 50-50, if it was like, it's really unlikely that something was the case, maybe then I would be like, no, pragmatic reasons just don't, they're not going to work that well in that case. But if there's this true symmetry where it's a real 50-50 tie and you're trying to decide, so what do I believe? It seems like you have a reason to go good God route.
Yeah, I agree. And actually that's interesting, because in a situation like that, arguably you have to believe something. You have to make a decision. So if something has to tip the balance, why not allow it to be what makes you feel good? Yeah, I definitely see your point. I think that's interesting.
Okay, so let's go then to this final category of response, which is impossibility objections.
Yeah, so this is interesting. Impossibility objections just basically argue that the concept of an evil God is incoherent. There cannot exist an all evil, all powerful, all knowing God. And there are various approaches you can take within this. So you might say that the most common approach here is saying, well, if God knows everything, then God would be good, because God would have an understanding of universal goodness, and then God would be able to act on that. So God would only do good. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say, because you're kind of making the underlying assumption that people, if they have knowledge of the good, will veer towards the good. Again, if that is something that you truly believe in, and that's an intuition that you have, then you're not going to be compelled by the evil God challenge. But I think that more work needs to be done to show that. And I think, at least in human beings, it's clear that people veer towards the bad even when they know what the good is. So I think then you would have to show, okay, why would God, why is it necessary that God would veer towards the good just because God has knowledge of everything? But that's the general idea of impossibility arguments.
Mm-hmm. Let me tease that out for a second. So I know somebody like Richard Swinburne wants to say God knows all, like, the moral facts. And this assumes that, like, moral realism is true, that there are such moral facts, but there are certainly going to be atheists that agree with moral realism. So assuming that God knows all these moral facts, and the assumption that you just highlighted is it's not enough for God just to know the moral facts. It has to be that, like, what underlies his motivation, God's motivation, is the idea that you're motivated to do whatever it is that you think is good.
Yeah.
So if he has knowledge of everything that's good, there's no there's no mistake about what the facts are in his. He knows what they are, and as long as you maintain that assumption that you do whatever you think is, I guess, ultimately best, or ultimately good, then yeah, it seems like you're going to get benevolence, omnibenevolence out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what you're calling into question is that assumption, like, why think that, at least in the human case, it seems like there are people who don't, that's not what underlies their motivation. They know what's good, and yet
They
they
don't do it.
do something else.
Right.
Am I tracking you there?
Yes.
Yeah. That's an interesting place to put pressure on. And I don't know enough, like, psychology, I guess, to be able to defend the view that people do what they ultimately think is best. I would plead ignorance on that point. It does seem plausible to me that people do what they think is ultimately best. It just may be that they're ignorant of facts about what is best.
Yeah. Yeah.
They may find that their own desires are more valuable than, like, the fulfillment of their own desires are just more valuable than somebody else. And so then they might act in a way that treats somebody else harshly, but they fulfilled their desire, and that's what they found most valuable.
Yeah.
That seems fairly plausible to me, but yeah, what would you say to that?
So I also think that could be plausible. I think ultimately, when it comes to God, it's going to depend on what your, I guess, meta ethical theory is. So are you, if you believe that God is, if you're assuming that God is the source of all morality, and you are a moral realist, then I think that would be a good approach to undermine the evil God challenge, because goodness has to come from God. So there's definitely a contradiction there. But I think that could be problematic with the, you could look at the fifth row dilemma, for example, and use that to kind of counter it. But I definitely think that's an interesting route to take. And I think the research on that at the moment seems to be a little underrepresented. So I hope that people will look into that a bit more, because I think
Mhm.
that could be a potential way to undermine the evil God challenge.
Yeah. I wasn't thinking of God as being the source. I know Swinburne doesn't think that. I don't really
Mm.
favor that God's the source of morality. Um,
So you would then just be saying that there is a source of morality and God has full knowledge of it,
he has full
and
knowledge of it,
God
and
must,
this motivation seems like a plausible motivation. Like
yeah,
I said, I don't have, like, the psychological research to back it up. It just seems like, um, we can explain cases where people don't do the good, in terms of, or what seems like a plausible explanation of why people don't perform what they think is good. Like, maybe they think, oh, it would be good for me to feed that child, but it's more valuable for me to live. So I'm going to eat the
Yeah.
food, and the child will starve, or something like that. And in that case, it's like they had that motivation of doing what they thought. You do whatever you think is ultimately best. It's just that they had wrong information
Yeah.
about what was truly the best. But in God's case, because he's omniscient, he won't be mistaken about what's ultimately best.
Yeah. So I see, I guess the evil God challenger would then say, well, evil God is trying to maximize evil. So God would purposefully go against that knowledge of external morality because God is purposely trying to maximize evil. Um, so
Mm-hmm.
that would be how evil God is different from humans in that way. So if we say that humans always do or never go away from the good if they have knowledge of it, their ignorance can be explained in other ways. Well, evil God is different because evil God is always trying to maximize evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll think about that. Maybe, I read one paper, I forgot, by Luke Wilson, maybe is his name,
Mm-hmm.
that speaks to this point, maybe in terms of in evil God, there's kind of like I'm going to use a term that he doesn't use, but it's like an unsatisfiable pair of desires, I guess, that you don't have in the case of good God. Either he or Callum Miller makes the point that, like, because of that, the good God hypothesis is simpler.
Yeah, so Miller definitely says that it's simpler, and other philosophers have argued that like evil God is, if there was an evil God, it would hate everything, including itself, because it would be
Mhm.
all hateful. So it would want to extinguish itself, and so it would just extinguish itself because it's all powerful.
Or
So
maybe that was the point that Luke Wilson was making, is rather than extinct, like, yeah. So I know some people say like it wants to kill itself, but it can't. But I think what Luke Wilson wants to say is because it hates itself, it wants to frustrate its own desires.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and so it has the desire to like cause all this suffering, but it also wants to make itself suffer. So
mm,
it tries to frustrate its desire to make other things suffer. Um, and there's this, maybe that's vaguely what, and I could be misremembering, but it's that he can't satisfy, evil God can't satisfy both. He can't satisfy all of his desires. Something like that.
yeah, yeah. So I think that's a really interesting approach to take. I think this would then lead to a really close psychological examination of evil God, if that doesn't sound too weird. So we have to really understand what does it mean to be maximally evil? Does it mean that we hate everything? Does it mean that we're sadistic, masochistic? And so I think that's something again that's really undeveloped in the literature. What does it mean to be truly, truly evil to its intrinsic maximum? So I think, yeah, that again is a really fruitful area for development.
Mhm. Okay, well, before we sum up, I may mention this. So here's one direction that I was thinking. The person that's going to try to object to the evil God challenge, they might go this direction. And I don't know how to categorize this. I think it's an asymmetry based on the way that you set it up. Yeah, it definitely seems like an asymmetry. I don't think it has to be an impossibility in
Mm.
that category. So in the literature on the gap problem, like the gap problem is how do you get from just these minimal set of attributes, like really, really powerful, to all powerful? Like, okay,
Mm.
whatever created the universe, if there is such a thing, then it would be really, really powerful. But how do you get from that to all powerful? And you might say, like, whatever designed the universe, if there is such a thing, um, it would have to have a lot of knowledge, but how do you get from that to all knowledge?
Yeah,
So one way that people have tried to respond to that sort of gap problem is to say, well, it's simpler. You can explain that data. It's a simpler hypothesis for it to have all knowledge rather than some like arbitrary limit on knowledge that leaves open or unexplained why only that amount of knowledge rather than just a little bit more?
Mm.
And why only that than just a little bit more? It's a simpler hypothesis to just say it has all. There's no arbitrary limits. But then you might apply something like that in the case of the evil God challenge and say something like this, like even evil God has some value to it. Like the fact that it has knowledge, that's valuable. Knowledge is valuable. The fact that it has some power is valuable. And so it has at least some value. But it's like in the evil God case, why does it only have like a limited amount of value, but not all? There's like a cutoff there because it's evil. It doesn't also have like good qualities in terms of like morally good. But in good God case, it's like across the board, you have values. And it seems like good God hypothesis is simpler because there's no limit to what the values are. That's just infinitely valuable. Got lots, not just a little bit of power, all power.
Yeah.
Not just a little bit of knowledge, all knowledge. Not just a little bit of goodness, all goodness. But there seems to be this kind of arbitrary limit to evil God. So evil God seems less simple, if that makes sense, than good God.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, there's two responses you could take. First of all, you could say, okay, yeah, well, if you are going to accept ontological simplicity and to say that we should accept the most simple idea, then okay, cool. Accept good God, the good God hypothesis. But you have to acknowledge that the only reason you're doing that is due to the factor of simplicity. But then I also think there's a danger of equating moral goodness with greatness without further justification. So I think sometimes people tend to say, and this kind of happens in the ontological argument a little bit as well, well, if God is the greatest being, then God must be all good. Well, that might be true, but I think you have to do more work to show that. Or you have to say, well, intuitively, being morally good is great, being omnibenevolent is a great making property. And if that's the case, then good God is greater than evil God. But I think then you would have to show why you think that, why benevolence is a great making property and malevolence isn't. And I think intuitively, it seems right that goodness is a great making property and evilness isn't. But then you would have to acknowledge my belief in the good God hypothesis is based on my intuition that goodness is greater than badness or evilness.
Mm-hmm. All right. I think this is a good place to sum up. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, it's great. And I think, I don't know, I think the evil God challenge overall is kind of misunderstood sometimes. It's not an atheistic argument. It's not trying to prove that there isn't any sort of God at all. It's just taking umbrage with the notion of omnibenevolence. So there are all sorts of theistic worldviews that don't postulate the omnibenevolent God, and the evil God challenge isn't trying to attack that. It's just really challenging this notion of omnibenevolence. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating challenge, but as our discussion has showed, there's a lot more to be done before we can conclude, yes, the evil God challenge can withstand any objections.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. LT, for doing this. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I've linked both of her papers in the description of this video. Go and read those. Also, be on the lookout for my interview with Dr. Max Baker Heitch on his co-authored paper with Ben Page, critiquing the evil God challenge. Hopefully you watch both interviews, and then you'll be really well informed. You'll hear this kind of broad overview and how someone might push back and how some of the premises can be defended. All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Jordan.